When I talk about problems that involve a fair degree of abstract reasoning, you may notice that I like to start the video with a very palpable, very pragmatic, real-world example. If you are living in the United States, Canada, or Australia, have you ever asked yourself the question of why, when the government has made its attempts to alleviate the poverty of the native people, of the indigenous people, why they did not redistribute ownership of land, of properties, of apartments, of condominiums, of office buildings within the downtown core of the biggest cities? Why is it that the government's strategy has been to grant land ownership to the most obscure, most remote, most poorly connected, most worthless pieces of land in the country? Now, if you think through a few stages of analysis here, you can imagine how everything would have changed for the indigenous people very rapidly within, say, the 20th century if the strategy had been the opposite, or even if you had a combined strategy with both features. So let's say the indigenous people of the northern United States of America were given this relatively worthless and remote land, but then also were given floors of different apartment buildings, different condominium buildings in major centers of commerce and industry. If they were given homes near factories in Detroit, back when Detroit's economy was booming in the middle of the 20th century. What if, back when there was the industrial boom in Oakland, California, and this sort of thing, what if native people had also, indigenous people had also been brought in and involved in that period of prosperity by being given houses and apartments right there? And even now, you could ask, well, there were new condominium towers being built in big cities like Vancouver and Toronto. What if these remote tribal peoples, not as a substitute for the land they already own, but as a supplement, what if they were also being given apartments and condominiums in these new towers being built in a city like Toronto and Vancouver? Now, not everyone will want to move from those remote rural locations to the downtown center of a major city. Not everyone will want to move near the factories to have access to employment, to have access to education, to have access to opportunity, right? To have access to healthcare, all the benefits being. Not everyone will. But even if some of those indigenous people choose to keep living on the land, maybe they want to be farmers or they want to be hunters, they want to continue that traditional lifestyle, suddenly they have a source of income. Like today, you can rent out the property through a website like Airbnb. You can just rent as a conventional landlord, have someone paying rent to you as a landlord, and then you can take that money and invest it in your business or your life. Even if you're just a hunter or a farmer, that's revenue that could then go back to that life you have out in the remote piece of land way out there, right? It's going to involve you positively in the prosperity of the big city in a way that these other forms of redistribution never can and never will. Now, so let me just ask you, why did the government in Canada or Australia never do this? My answer is because it would work. Because they knew it would work. I think it's really quite intentional, the extent to which our indigenous people were forcibly excluded from the economy of manufacturing, mining, everything worth having, everything worth being a part of in the 20th century. And I'm saying the 20th century intentionally, and once you get back to the 19th century and the 18th century, you're in the much more overtly genocidal period. Now, a brief aside, this is not going too far off the beaten track of this video. All my life, I heard these kind of false allegations against the government of Japan that they had committed genocide in much the same way or worse against the indigenous people of the far north of Japan, all right? So the Ainu are the only group anyone knows the name of in English, but the Ainu are not the only indigenous group up there. There are several different ethnic groups, different languages, different. But suffice to say, there are indigenous people there who are not Japanese. And I was shocked when I did the research, and again, this is not the whole history of the whole of Japan, these are these people in North Japan, that what the Japanese government in fact did, for example, when they relocated the indigenous people who had been kicked out of Sakhalin, so Sakhalin's the far, far north of Japan, Sakhalin and the other islands nearby, when those people had to be settled on the Japanese mainland, so to speak, there is no mainland, they're just bigger and smaller islands, when they had to be resettled, what they did was take row houses, good old 20th century row houses, near industrial estates, near booming, thriving industries. Just like Detroit had its period of expanding heavy industry, Japan also had a period of expanding. There was employment for anyone, even if you were completely illiterate, you could have good employment in the factories at that time, and many of these people were illiterate. They gave them homes adjacent to booming factories and rapidly growing cities. And those homes became valuable. And the jobs those people were able to get involved them in the economy positively. And they didn't lead a ghettoized life the way our indigenous people did. They became a positive, productive part of Japanese society. They shared in, sort of the, shall we say, the boom of 20th century industrialization in Japan in a way that our native people in Canada, the United States, and Australia, they did not share. Now, along with that, of course, many of those indigenous people, they would have at first been illiterate and at a low level of education when they were brought in to work in the factories. Obviously, there would have been pressure on them within a generation or two to compete in terms of their level of education and participate in, learning the language of Japanese society and everything else. And again, that's very different from the kind of segregation and isolation the indigenous people of Canada, the United States struggled against, where on the one hand they were forced to assimilate through religious education, and the United States, unlike Canada, there was also a big significance for actually military organization. Very few people know about that history of basically the military setting up assimilationist training camps. By the way, this whole history is closely parallel also to what the Soviet Union did to their native people out in Siberia. People like the Kets out in eastern Siberia. Another story, but sadly when you do the research, very much the same story. Forced assimilation, isolation, exclusion from all the advantages of the country. In the year 2020, people are once again asking about redistribution of wealth on a massive scale. And that question is important. And it's also really important for us to understand the ways in which the posing of the question almost inevitably leads to the wrong answers. Okay? You may have heard me say some sympathetic things about the concept of redistribution of wealth, but I'm also its harshest critic. I wasn't born yesterday. I'm going to talk you through this real quickly. Land is just one form of wealth. If you believe that the purpose of redistributing wealth is to achieve equality, talking through this example quickly will let you see that no, redistribution of land is a great example where redistribution of wealth, if it's defined in this way, if this is how we conceive of it, will actually just produce a new aristocracy and unbelievable inequality worse than what we have now. Now, why would we sympathize with redistribution of land? Because I sympathize. I just see the problems with it. I see the shortcomings. Okay. South Korea was conquered by Japan. At the end of World War II, pretty much everyone who had money and who owned land, they were people who had worked with the Japanese regime, or they were some kind of hated and resented Japanese imperial overlord. So when they had their liberty, they became an independent nation state. They had a situation of intolerable, unjustifiable inequality, where it's like, well, there were the Japanese people and the pro-Japanese people, and then there were the Korean people, and South Africa at the end of apartheid, right? So you have a situation where everyone who's rich, either they were the hated white people who led this white supremacist regime, or in some cases they were non-white people but who worked with this hated white supremacist regime. And at the end of apartheid, South Africa had a sort of revolution, right? So you say, okay, well, this is unjust. We have to redistribute wealth. there is a claim being made in the United States in the year 2020 that you have a society still that echoes the fundamental inequality of having a society built on slavery and genocide, that the people who have money, the people who have a status almost like aristocrats in the society, they are the descendants of the slave owners and people who benefited from that segregated, racially unequal society. And of course, I mean, you can measure this. Although that's not 100% true, there's plenty of truth to it. How much of the wealth distribution in the United States today, you don't have to go as far back as slavery. You can look at the period of redlining, soft segregation. You can look at decade by decade the ways in which the wealth inequality in the United States of America today is the result of past systemic racism. There is some truth to that. And of course, there are limits to that analysis. You cannot make the claim that 100% of wealth inequality in the United States of America is for these historical reasons. So there's a moral or ethical argument here in favor of redistribution that's fundamentally built on the perception of the evils of the society you currently have. Now again, South Africa, at the end of apartheid, more extreme. South Korea, after being liberated from Japanese occupation, more extreme, very easy. How about the Nazi regime at the end of World War II, once you tore down the Nazis, right? There are all kinds of situations like this where there's a moral imperative, there's an ethical imperative for redistribution. But that can blind you to the questions of what redistribution actually is and how it works. The map of British Columbia, I'm just going to ask you to imagine a little square cut out of the map of British Columbia, and this is such a simple description of geography. This applies to most of planet Earth. You'll see why in just a moment. Your situation in Australia or wherever you live will not be so different from what I'm about to say. Okay, so we take this square of the map, and we take a ruler, and we draw lines horizontally and vertically. We say, hey, great, we divided the map into a bunch of perfectly equal squares. Now we're going to roll a dice, and we're going to distribute the land on this map to everyone equally, arbitrarily, and at random. Now, if you have the delusion this is going to create equality, you're wrong. If your delusion is that the current distribution of land ownership is so fundamentally evil, like it's the product of the Nazi regime or the Japanese conquering your country or apartheid, if your perception is that the current distribution is so evil that any redistribution is preferable, that's a different perspective. By the end of this video, I think I'm going to try to convince you that that's not a reasonable perspective to take. So this map, this square cut out of the province of British Columbia, some of the land has a view of the ocean. Some of the land is adjacent to a major road. And the vast majority of the land has no view of the ocean. It has no road access. It has no electricity, no sewage, no prospect of opening a shop, no prospect of opening a gas station, no prospect of employment, nothing you can farm. It's rocky wasteland, right? And some of it, even if it could be farmed, would require an enormous investment to make it profitable or even break even to develop that land into agricultural land, right? So what have you actually done in redistributing the land equally? The people who were given land with a view of the ocean, they will be incredibly wealthy. Their descendants will be incredibly wealthy for the next 7 generations. You've created a new aristocracy. The people who happen to be given land right on the highway, let's say there's one major highway going north-south and one going east-west. For huge parts of Canada, you're lucky if there's even that. Huge parts of this country have no roads to speak of. There's a logging trail, and nothing else. There's lots of, and again, this relates to the fate of our Indigenous people in these remote and inaccessible places. There are places that are only accessible by bush plane and places that are only accessible in winter when the road is frozen. We have a real problem with transportation in this country, okay? The people who happen to get land next to a road, they have prospects. Maybe not quite as good as the people with view of the ocean, but they could open a gas station, they could open a shop, they could build a house or an apartment or something, and they could rent it out. That building could have value, right? You have actually created a new and extreme disparity between the rich and the poor. And some of you might say, oh, well, The squares on the map don't have to be the same size. A square with a view of the ocean is worth much more, so we'll make it smaller. A square with access to the road is more valuable, so we'll make it smaller. And the rocky, barren wilderness that has nothing, we could make those sort of... And you roll the dice and you redistribute the land, and you have the same fundamental problem. The value of land, the value of a house, the value of an apartment building, or even the value of an office building, right, is only relative to the productive potential of that piece of land, of that location, allow me to say. Okay? Detroit is full of empty and abandoned houses, even empty and abandoned apartment buildings, condominium towers, empty and abandoned factories, too. These things are related, right? Today, if you give the native people, if you give poor people who are living in the middle of the desert an abandoned house in the middle of Detroit, what are you really giving them? Are you giving them a blessing or a curse, right? The value of that house was created and sustained by having access to employment. Now, on a smaller scale, these things are easy to visualize. Like you have a town where all the houses are worth a certain amount of money, and the apartment buildings and the apartments are worth a certain amount of money, and the economy is all pinned to one mine. The mine runs out of copper, the mine closes down, suddenly all the buildings are worthless, right? And the shops close down, and suddenly offices are worthless too. Maybe a few businesses stay in the office, but a lot of them are empty. A lot of them close down and leave. I did a video about a year ago about universities closing in the United States of America. There are university towns where the main business is a university. If that university shuts down and disappears, well, all of the apartments and houses, directly and indirectly, were linked to the employment or providing housing for students, right? So suddenly all of that is worthless because of that adjacency, because of that opportunity, right? This is relatively easy to visualize when you're talking about land ownership, when you're talking about physical buildings, and it's harder to visualize for the rest of the economy. But the value of most of the things you can own, right? It's not something static and inert. It has to do with productive capacity. It has to do with output, right? Now, this is very unlikely to happen as dramatically as everything closing down in Detroit, everything closing down when a university closes, right? But the value of owning a piece of paper that says you have shares in Apple Computer, right? That's based on the future productive output of Apple Computer. So if there's some scandal and everybody stops buying Apple Computer, right, you know the value of this piece of paper goes down or declines. If there's some new scientific discovery that makes their computers totally obsolete and nobody wants to buy them that reason, again, this is not actually going to happen. But examples like this have happened. And well, look, let's not digress in things. But what's hard to perceive is the value of this piece of land or this house here or now is it's not something stored up. It's not something latent or inherent in that land, right? It's because the location of that land gives you access to employment, gives you access to opportunity, lets you participate in production, lets you participate in economic output, okay? Now, most of the arguments against wealth redistribution are very insincere. Most of the people who will point out the disadvantages of wealth redistribution are doing so just because they want to suggest to you that the inequalities we already have are optimal. So you shouldn't question who's rich and who's poor, who owns land and who doesn't, because you couldn't possibly improve on it. That's ridiculous, right? Now, on the other side, I've already suggested, if you just assume the wealth distribution you have is completely evil, like this is so terrible that any redistribution will be better, that can also be misleading. The problem with the right-wing and conservative critique of wealth redistribution is that it never really bothers to explain in a pragmatic way what will work and what won't with redistribution. What you need to do is shift from a mentality of redistributing static wealth thought of as something static, to a redistribution of opportunity. Okay? That is fundamentally why giving Indigenous people apartments in apartment buildings in downtown Toronto, in downtown Vancouver, back when Detroit was a booming industrial town, in downtown Detroit, getting them access to jobs in factories in the most densely populated cities. That's why that would have worked. All right? It's not the value of the apartment on paper that matters. It's not the value of the condominium in the condominium tower that matters. It's precisely that they would have access to education, access to jobs, access to opportunity. And now, again, depending how far back we're going in this hypothetical example, it might even be especially important to emphasize access to jobs that don't require a high school diploma, access to jobs that don't require university education. During the 20th century, all these countries, Canada, United States, Australia, they were actively importing immigrant labor to do jobs. Immigrant laborers who didn't speak English and who didn't have high school diplomas or didn't have a high school diploma in English to do jobs in factories. Those opportunities existed. The government was reaching out and giving them to new immigrants. They were not giving them to our own Indigenous people, which would have taken some work that wouldn't have been easy to do, maybe, right? But if you're talking about 100 years ago or something, and these are people who didn't have access to the same education as white people, it would have been especially something like access to factory jobs in Detroit and this kind of thing, where you could have, in a really positive way, drawn these people out of poverty. But why? Somebody who's looking at this in a static sense would say, oh, well, that's obvious. The reason why is that an apartment downtown is worth more money than a huge plot of land in the middle of the barren wilderness. Now, there was a very simplified discussion of what makes land valuable and not before. In Laos, in Cambodia, and all these places have had to deal with this issue. If you're redistributing wealth in order to achieve equality, some land has gold and some doesn't. Some land has oil and some doesn't. Some land can grow an orchard effortlessly, and some land would take an unbelievable level of human labor and investment to get an orchard going. And then once you do, it's still not as productive and it still doesn't produce as high quality fruit as the other orchard on the other land, right? Like the inequality of the soil, the inequality of farming conditions for different crops, it's mind-blowing. I remember in southern Laos, I read technical scientific studies on this, and it was just mind-blowing. It was like, oh yeah, well over here, it had to do with the formation of the valley in prehistoric times by a volcano that was no longer visible. It was now a volcano, the remains of which are below the topsoil. It was like, oh, because there was a volcano over here, you can grow coffee and grapes, and they turn out great. And just over here, the soil is hopeless. And getting into the technical reasons that the land itself is not equal, even in its productive capacity this way. So you're talking about empty land. What's valuable, it may not be obvious to the naked eye. It may not be obvious when you're glancing at a map. You can get into, national geological surveys, national agricultural service surveys that are color coding land and trying to make it visible where the land is valuable and not for exactly these kinds of reasons. But again, you're not creating equality. You're creating aristocracy because somebody gets the land that grows an amazing quality grapes, that grows coffee that's really valuable, and somebody gets land that's rocky and worthless, and somebody gets land that can literally have a gold mine on it, and they become wealthy and their descendants become wealthy, and that's it, right? So the arbitrary inequality is only being reinforced through this kind of redistribution, right? What works is not redistribution of wealth per se. It is redistribution of opportunity, right? That is in many ways the puzzle we're dealing with in the 21st century. And I would hope that all of the stupidity, all of the extremism, all of the anguish of the year 2020 will lead to a renewed investigation of what redistribution of opportunity really means. The United States of America is a country where people are expected to go more than $100,000 into debt to get a university degree. And at the end of that process, it remains really debatable whether or not that university degree is worth anything, whether or not it actually does open up any opportunity to you. I looked at a study of what university degrees do the poorest Native Americans enroll in trying to get out of poverty. And it was no surprise they follow exactly the same pattern as immigrants from the Philippines. They're taking courses in nursing. When they don't have the money to become a full nurse, they get these lower level credentials and work in an old folks home, taking care of the elderly, and save up their money and then go back and get more credentials to become a nurse who can, operate an x-ray machine or what have you, get these other nursing credentials. That's one of the most common, the steps being taken for people who are not just born in the United States of America, but whose ancestors have been born there for thousands of years. They're still struggling from this remote position on the periphery to come into the city and have access to those opportunities, have access to that education. And if anything, they're still at a disadvantage relative to new immigrants who've just arrived from Europe or just arrived from Asia or what have you. This is seen. If you walk around Los Angeles today, you see 40,000 Chinese people. You see tens of thousands of Chinese, Japanese, Filipino, Koreans, right, who've been able to make those transitions. Some of them by becoming nurses or what have you, right? And there's this terrible struggle going on the outer cusp of American civilization, which is where you sequestered, where you isolated, your native people. So, the complaint that the distribution of wealth you have now is fundamentally bad and evil and wrong is valid. It's valid, it's important, it's meaningful, it's real. But you can't let that lead you into a meaningless and ultimately self-destructive pursuit of the redistribution of wealth with the assumption that any new distribution you could arrive at will be better than the one that you already have. If you tried to reproduce what the free market already has accomplished in changing the prices and the value of land, if you try to take that map and say, okay, we're not going to divide them into equal squares. We're going to try to make the size and the price reflect what can really be done with the land. Step by step, what you're trying to do is, from the position of central planning in the government, reproduce what only the free market can accomplish. And what you need to learn to appreciate, it's very hard for left-wing people, is that there is this mysterious quality to the mechanisms of the free market, because it's judging the value of land day after day after day, again and again and again, that it has already assigned values to these land in a way that no central planner ever could. And now we have to take a step back and say, okay, we've got almost infinite money collected from taxpayers, and we've got a mandate to do something the free market never could. And that is that we have to try to provide opportunity to people who have none. That's something the free market will never do, right? The free market only provides you with an opportunity when you can afford to pay, when you can pay enough to incentivize those people who are going to give you that opportunity. So the role of government here is not really to demolish or abolish what the free market does, but to understand in a sophisticated way those opportunities that the poor and the disadvantaged are cut off from, and to undo the fundamental evil of isolating black people who were liberated slaves and making them into sharecroppers, right? Isolating indigenous people and putting them on reservations, right? The 21st century, the challenge we have is precisely to reach out to those people who either conceptually or literally were out on the periphery of society and bring them in to share in the opportunities that are at the center.